Vinland, North America, around the year 1009. A settlement of Vikings 500 years before Columbus. And in this remote outpost on the edge of the known world, a heavily pregnant woman is about to commit one of the most brutal acts in Viking history. Her name is Freydis Eiriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, the founder of Greenland's Norse settlements, sister to Leif Erikson, the famous explorer who first reached North America. But Freydis's legacy would be written in blood, not discovery. When conflict erupted in Vinland, Freydis didn't hide. She didn't flee. She didn't wait for the men to protect her. Instead, she grabbed a sword from a fallen warrior, exposed her pregnant belly to the enemy, and struck the blade against her chest while screaming a war cry so terrifying that grown men ran in fear. This is the story of the most brutal, controversial, and fascinating woman in Viking history. A woman so violent that even the Vikings, a culture that celebrated warriors, were shocked by what she did. A woman whose actions were so extreme that they may have ended Norse attempts to settle North America for good. This is the true story of Freydis Eiriksdottir. To understand Freydis, you first need to understand where she came from, because violence, ambition, and ruthlessness weren't just personality traits for Freydis, they were her family legacy. Her father was Erik Thorvaldsson, better known as Eric the Red, and there's a reason he had that nickname. Eric the Red wasn't called the Red just because of his hair color, though he did have red hair and a red beard. The name also referred to the blood on his hands. Eric the Red was exiled from Norway for manslaughter. He killed people, multiple people. The sources aren't entirely clear on the details, but the sagas tell us it was serious enough that he had to flee Norway entirely. So he went to Iceland. But Eric couldn't stay out of trouble. In Iceland, he got into more conflicts, more feuds, more killings. Eventually, around 982 AD, he was exiled from Iceland too for 3 years for committing more murders. Think about that. He was so violent that even Viking society, which was pretty tolerant of violence, kicked him out twice. So what did Eric do during his exile? He explored. He sailed west and discovered Greenland, or rather he rediscovered it, as Irish monks had probably been there earlier. When his exile ended, Eric returned to Iceland and convinced hundreds of people to follow him to this new land. He called it Greenland as a marketing trick. It was actually mostly ice and rock, but the name made it sound appealing. Eric the Red established the first permanent Norse settlements in Greenland around 985 AD. He became a powerful chieftain, respected and feared. And it was in this harsh, isolated environment that Freydis grew up. Freydis was one of Eric's daughters, probably illegitimate, born to a woman who wasn't Eric's wife. This meant she had the bloodline, the name recognition, and the connections of Eric's family, but not the full inheritance or status of a legitimate heir. That would matter later. Her father grew up hearing stories of her father's violence and exile. She grew up with her brothers, including Leif Erikson, who around the year 1000 AD became the first known European to set foot in North America, which he called Vinland, Wineland, or Meadowland, depending on how you translate the Old Norse. Freydis grew up in a culture that valued strength, courage, and the willingness to use violence. But even by those standards, what Freydis would do was extreme. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and discovered a rich green land full of forests, wild grapes, and salmon. He called it Vinland. For people living on the rocky, treeless coast of Greenland, this was paradise. Timber alone made it valuable. Greenland had almost no trees, and wood had to be imported at great expense. Leif spent one winter in Vinland, established a small settlement at a place we now call Lance O'Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, and then returned to Greenland with tales of this abundant land. But Leif never went back. He became busy managing his father's estates and his own growing power in Greenland. Other Vikings, however, were very interested in Vinland. The sagas tell us of several expeditions in the years following Leif's discovery. One expedition was led by a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni, an Icelandic merchant who married into Eric the Red's family. Thorfinn gathered about 160 people, men, women, children, and livestock, with the intention of establishing a permanent colony in Vinland. This wasn't just a raid or a quick voyage. This was an attempt at colonization. Freydis wanted in. By this time, Freydis was married to a man named Thorvard. The sagas describe Thorvard as weak and unimpressive, not a match for Freydis's ambition and ferocity. But the marriage gave her a degree of independence and resources. When Thorfinn Karlsefni organized his expedition, Freydis negotiated to join. But here's where things get interesting. Freydis didn't go as someone's wife or sister. She went as a leader in her own right, commanding her own ship and her own crew. The saga specifically mentions this. Freydis brought her own ship to Vinland. She had authority, she had followers, and she had ambitions that would soon turn deadly. The expedition sailed west from Greenland, following Leif's route. They found Vinland, found the settlement Leif had built, and attempted to establish a permanent presence. They brought livestock, they planted crops, they explored the coastline and rivers. But there were problems. First, there were the native people. The sagas call them skrælings, which basically means wretches or barbarians. These were likely the indigenous peoples of North America, possibly Mi'kmaq or other northeastern native groups. At first, there was trade. The Vikings had metal goods, cloth, and dairy products. The natives had furs and knowledge of the land. But cultural misunderstandings, language barriers, and perhaps inevitable conflicts led to violence. The sagas describe battles between the Norse and the natives. And this is where Freydis first showed her terrifying nature. The saga of Eric the Red describes this moment in vivid detail, and it's one of the most famous scenes in all of Viking literature. The Norse settlement was attacked by a large group of native warriors. The exact circumstances aren't entirely clear. The sagas, written down centuries later by Christian monks, aren't always reliable. But the general story is consistent across sources. The Norse warriors came in force, possibly responding to some offense by the Vikings, possibly trying to drive out these strange invaders. They were numerous, they knew the terrain, and they caught the Norse by surprise. The Viking men panicked. These were warriors who had raided across Europe, who prided themselves on courage in battle, who worshipped gods of war. But faced with an enemy they didn't understand, using tactics they hadn't encountered, in terrain they didn't know, they broke and ran. Freydis watched the men flee, and she was furious. Remember, Freydis was pregnant at this time, heavily pregnant. In any other culture, in any other story, a pregnant woman would be evacuated first, protected above all others. Not Freydis. The saga tells us that Freydis shouted at the fleeing men, "Why do you run from these wretches, brave men like you? If I had weapons, I think I could fight better than any of you." But the men kept running. They were terrified. So Freydis took matters into her own hands. Literally, she found a dead Viking warrior, one who had been killed in the initial attack. She took his sword, and then she did something so shocking, so psychologically brutal, that it's been debated by historians for centuries. Freydis pulled out one of her breasts, exposing her pregnant body, and struck it with the flat of the sword while screaming at the attacking natives. The saga says the natives were so terrified by this sight that they stopped their attack and fled. Think about the psychological impact of this moment. Here was a heavily pregnant woman, alone, not running, not hiding, but instead exposing her vulnerability and turning it into a weapon. The sheer audacity, the complete reversal of expected behavior, the primal ferocity of the act, it broke the enemy's morale completely. This wasn't just courage. This was psychological warfare of the highest order. Freydis understood that sometimes the most terrifying thing you can do is refuse to show fear when you have every reason to be afraid. The Viking men, shamed by a pregnant woman's courage, rallied and drove off the remaining attackers. The settlement was saved. Freydis became a legend. But if the story ended there, Freydis would just be remembered as a fierce warrior woman, a shield maiden who saved her people. That's not why she's remembered as the most brutal Viking woman in history. What happened next was far worse. After the conflict with the natives, the Vinland expedition faced a harsh reality. This land was already inhabited by people who didn't want them there. The dream of a permanent Norse colony in North America was looking increasingly difficult. But there was still wealth to be extracted. Timber, furs, and other resources could be taken back to Greenland and Iceland for enormous profit. So some of the settlers decided to focus on that, gather what they could, and return home rich. Now, the sagas tell us about two different Vinland expeditions by Freydis, and historians debate whether these were the same voyage or two separate trips. For storytelling clarity, I'm going to focus on the most detailed account, Freydis's second expedition to Vinland. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, Freydis approached two Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, with a business proposition. She proposed that they pool their resources and mount a joint expedition to Vinland. They would share everything equally: ships, crew, profits from timber and furs. The brothers agreed. They borrowed a Leif Eriksson's buildings in Vinland. Leif had given permission for his relatives to use them, but not to own them. The agreement was clear. Both parties would contribute equally, share equally, and each group would bring no more than 30 fighting men plus women. But Freydis had no intention of honoring this agreement. First, she broke the deal immediately. She secretly brought 35 fighting men, 5 more than agreed. This might seem like a small thing, but in Viking culture, honor and oath-keeping were everything. Breaking your word was a serious offense. Freydis started with deception. The expedition reached Vinland and began work, but tensions arose almost immediately. Freydis demanded that the brothers move out of Leif's buildings, the ones they were all supposed to share, claiming they were only for Leif's relatives. The brothers, wanting to avoid conflict, agreed and built their own hall nearby. This is where things get dark, because what happens next suggests premeditation. Freydis wasn't just fierce or violent, she was calculating, she was manipulative, and she was about to orchestrate mass murder. Winter came to Vinland. The settlers were trapped by ice and weather, unable to sail home until spring. In the long, dark nights, Freydis set her plan in motion. The saga tells us that Freydis went to the brothers' hall early one morning while it was still dark. She went barefoot in the frost and wearing only her husband Thorvard's cloak. This detail matters. It's an intimate garment, and her wearing it would suggest vulnerability and perhaps a secret visit. Freydis knocked on the door. Finnbogi, one of the brothers, answered. Freydis asked to speak with him. They went outside, sat down on a log, and talked. Freydis told Finnbogi that she was unhappy in Greenland, that she wanted to leave, that she wanted to go home to Iceland, where her family originally came from. She asked if the brothers would be willing to trade ships with her ship for theirs, because their ship was larger and better for the journey she wanted to make. Finnbogi, probably exhausted and wanting to end this strange middle-of-the-night conversation, agreed to the trade. Freydis thanked him and left. But when Freydis returned to her own hall, she didn't go to bed. She climbed into bed with her feet cold and wet from the frost. This woke up her husband Thorvard, who asked why she was so cold and wet. And this is where Freydis revealed her true nature as a manipulator. Freydis told her husband a complete lie. She said she had gone to the brothers to propose a ship trade, but when she made the offer, Finnbogi had beaten her and abused her. She claimed the brothers had humiliated and assaulted her. Then Freydis delivered her ultimatum to Thorvard. And now I demand that you avenge this insult, or else I will divorce you. Remember the Viking divorce laws we discussed in the previous video? A woman could divorce her husband for showing weakness or failing to defend her honor. Freydis was threatening her husband's masculinity, his honor, and his marriage in one statement. The saga tells us that Thorvard could not endure her reproaches. He was trapped by the culture's expectations of masculinity and honor. If he didn't act, he would be shamed as a weak, pathetic husband who allowed his wife to be insulted. So Thorvard gathered his men. Remember, Freydis had brought 35 fighters, more than agreed. Thorvard armed them and led them to the brothers' hall while everyone inside was still asleep. They burst in and seized Helgi, Finnbogi, and all their men. They bound them with ropes. As each man was tied up, he was led outside. And as each man came out, Freydis ordered him killed. One by one, the brothers and all their male followers, probably around 30 men, were executed in the cold dawn, murdered in their sleep because of a lie Freydis had told. The saga is very specific about what happened next. After all the men were dead, 5 women remained, the wives, sisters, and servants of the murdered men. Thorvard's men refused to kill women. Even by Viking standards, killing unarmed women was too much. But not for Freydis. Freydis demanded the women be killed. When the men refused, the saga tells us that Freydis said, "Give me an axe." Someone handed her an axe, and Freydis personally murdered all 5 women herself. Think about this. Freydis engineered the murder of approximately 35 people, 30 men and 5 women, through deception, manipulation, and personal violence. She lied to her husband to start the massacre, and when the men wouldn't finish it, she picked up an axe and completed the slaughter herself. This wasn't battle. This wasn't self-defense. This wasn't even a fair fight. This was premeditated mass murder. After the massacre, Freydis had a problem. She had just murdered her business partners and their entire crew. When word of this got back to Greenland, she would face severe consequences. Murder was one thing, but this level of treachery, killing people you'd made agreements with, breaking oaths, violating guest right, this was the kind of thing that could get you outlawed. So Freydis organized a cover-up.